Hello everyone, and welcome back to our next chapter in Anatomy and Physiology 2. Chapter 25 will cover the concepts of metabolism and nutrition. It's quite an appropriate time for us to be going back and hashing out these concepts once again, as we've just now finished the digestive system, and we've talked quite a bit about how our body takes in nutrients for energy. If you remember, you would have likely covered Chapter 25 to some degree in Anatomy and Physiology 1. ANP1's grasp of metabolism focused in upon glycolysis, the formation of acetyl coenzyme A, the Krebs cycle, as well as the electron transport chain, which all make up the process of cellular respiration. The whole goal of cellular respiration is to turn glucose into 30 to 32 molecules of ATP. That's how our body produces ATP, and that's why it's very important that we discuss that in Anatomy and Physiology 1. So we are going to hash out some of the concepts here with metabolism once again in this class. However, we're not going to go as in-depth as we went in ANP1, and we just want to get a general idea of the concepts of metabolism that relate to nutrition. So as we go through this chapter, you'll find some familiar concepts, but we want to look at Chapter 25 this time through a different lens. So one thing that we will have to rehash out from ANP1 is the difference between catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions are chemical reactions where larger molecules are broken down into their more simple subunits. Catabolic reactions release energy, and that energy is often captured in the form of ATP. You can see that complex molecules, such as glycogen, proteins, and triglycerides, will be broken down through catabolic reactions into their monomeric subunits, glucose, amino acids, as well as glycerol and fatty acids. These are the monomers of carbohydrates, proteins, and triglycerides, which we see right here. So it is through these catabolic reactions that we're breaking down these complex molecules into their more simple forms and also getting ATP as a byproduct from this. But anabolic reactions, on the other hand, are exactly the opposite. Anabolic reactions are when we take smaller subunits and we link them together to form much larger complex molecules. Anabolic reactions will require ATP. And so therefore, we have this nice coupling of catabolic and anabolic reactions with ATP. When catabolic reactions are breaking down larger substances, they're generally producing ATP, and that ATP can then go and be used in anabolic reactions to build up different larger molecules. Metabolism in general can be defined as all of the chemical reactions that happen within our body. So all of the catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions in our bodies fall under the blanket term of metabolism. And it is ATP that will couple these two reactions together under the term metabolism. So just to serve as a reminder from the metabolism concepts that was covered during ANP1, we can see that cellular respiration is shown on this slide. Cellular respiration refers to the breakdown of glucose into ATP. So within cellular respiration, which is also referred to as aerobic respiration, as this process requires energy, we have the breakdown of glucose all the way through several different reactions to eventually get ATP, which is our body's energy currency. The four main reactions in cellular respiration were glycolysis, the formation of acetyl coenzyme A, the Krebs cycle, as well as the electron transport chain. Glycolysis consisted of glucose being broken down into two molecules of pyruvic acid, which is the exact same thing as pyruvate. Glycolysis consists of 10 different reactions, and in the process we actually have to invest 2 molecules of ATP. But also through glycolysis, we actually get out 4 molecules of ATP. So therefore we have a net gain of 2 ATP through the process of glycolysis. And we also will end up with pyruvic acid, which can be converted to acetyl coenzyme A as long as oxygen is present. Acetyl coenzyme A is the molecule that's required to enter into the Krebs cycle. And so it is in the Krebs cycle that acetyl coenzyme A will enter and produce what is known as NADH and FADH2. NADH and FADH2 are both energy transferring molecules that will take energetic electrons over to the electron transport chain that is embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane. Electrons will jump from transmembrane protein to transmembrane protein through the electron transport chain, and through the enzyme ATP synthase, we will make our ATP that we're trying to get for energy in the body. Now, it's not so terribly important that we go through all of those metabolic reactions once again. But what is important for you to understand is that glucose is a carbohydrate, and so therefore carbohydrates can go through and give us ATP. We can also see that lipids and proteins are two other macromolecules that can feed into metabolism and eventually also be used to make ATP in the event that our glucose stores run out. Once our glycogen stores are gone, we're then going to tap into our fats for energy. So as we've just discussed the digestive system, we've talked about all different types of digestive enzymes that break down carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins into their smaller monomeric subunits. Those smaller monomeric subunits will be absorbed into our bloodstream and then pass through the hepatic portal circulation. And it is in the hepatic portal circulation that these nutrients will be extracted and brought into the liver. The liver will play a very big role in synthesizing glycogen, but it will also direct fatty acid transport around the body. We're going to individually break down the metabolism of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and we're going to talk about some related concepts to each. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about carbohydrate metabolism. It's very possible that in Anatomy and Physiology 1, you heard the statement that carbohydrate metabolism is mostly glucose metabolism. Well, this is a very true and important statement because glucose is the primary monosaccharide that our body's going to be managing. There are 5 monosaccharides, namely glucose, galactose, fructose, ribose, and deoxyribose. While all 5 of these monosaccharides can be absorbed from the diet, they'll eventually be converted into either glucose or glycogen to be broken down and metabolized as glucose. So that's why we say this statement that carbohydrate metabolism is mostly glucose metabolism. Because the end product is going to be glucose, and it will be glucose that can enter into our glycolytic pathway that will eventually give us ATP. So depending upon the needs of our body, glucose is going to be used to make different things. We've seen in AMP1 that ATP production is going to be one of the major roles for glucose in the body. But we can also form many other amino acids in the event that we need them. We can store excess glucose as glycogen for later energy. And if we have enough, we can also start to store glucose as triglycerides in our adipocytes. All of these needs go back to the fact that glucose will be needed by our cells for energy. So whether we have just the right amount of glucose or we have glucose in an excess, glucose is going to be broken down and any extra will be converted to storage forms for energy. So one practice that maximizes energy in our bodies is known as carbohydrate loading. You've probably heard of carbohydrate loading before, and if you're an athlete, it's very possible that you've used this practice before a time or two. Carbohydrate loading includes taking in very large amounts of very complex polysaccharides that can be found in pastas and potatoes, so that we can maximize our glycogen stores before a large event. If you're a marathon runner, or a baseball player, or perhaps a swimmer, and you have a race or a game coming up, it's important to have as much energy on standby as possible. And carbohydrate loading makes this possible. By building up our glycogen stores, we can have more glycogen available to liberate glucose and break it down for ATP for the upcoming event that we are carb loading for. So next up, we're going to discuss a little bit more about lipids. Lipid metabolism is a little bit different than glucose metabolism because of the chemical structure of lipids. Lipids are made up of a glycerol backbone with fatty acid tails. And fatty acids are hydrocarbons that are very, very long chains of hydrogens bound to carbons. Because of this chemical structure, these molecules are non-polar, and therefore they are hydrophobic, which means that they do not mix well in water. Another word for hydrophobic is lipophilic, because hydrophobic substances do not like water, but do like to interact with lipids. So when we consider nutrition and metabolism, this hydrophobic structure of lipids poses an issue as the bloodstream, which is going to be transporting lipids, is mostly made up of water. And since lipids do not dissolve well in water, we're going to have other components that will be used to transport lipids throughout the bloodstream. Our molecules of interest are known as lipoproteins. Lipoproteins are made up of phospholipids, proteins, and cholesterol molecules. And they form a shell to wrap around triglycerides to help them be transported throughout the bloodstream. Specifically, there are 4 different types of lipoproteins, and each of them will transport something different in the bloodstream. Our 4 classes of lipoproteins are chylomicrons, very low-density lipoproteins, abbreviated as VLDLs, low-density lipoproteins, abbreviated as LDLs, and high-density lipoproteins, abbreviated as HDLs. Each one of these lipoproteins facilitates a different type of transport throughout the bloodstream. Generally, what we see with these lipoproteins is that chylomicrons are going to be very, very large, but they're not very dense. And HDLs, or high-density lipoproteins, are going to be much smaller, but they're going to be much, much denser, as their name suggests. Each of these lipoproteins carries either lipids or cholesterol from one place to another in the body, but those destinations will be different. Let's first discuss chylomicrons. Chylomicrons are going to be transporting dietary lipids from the digestive system to our adipocytes. Once dietary lipids have made their way to the adipocytes, they're going to be packed in there for storage. Chylomicrons will enter the lacteals of our intestinal villi, and from here they're carried back through the lymphatic system and dumped back into the bloodstream. A little bit more denser than the chylomicrons will have the very low-density lipoproteins. These are specifically going to take triglycerides from the hepatocytes to the adipocytes. Our hepatocytes form these very low-density lipoproteins. The fatty acids formed in our hepatocytes will be packaged up into these VLDLs and brought out to our adipocytes for storage. Low-density lipoproteins are going to carry cholesterol, specifically the majority of our cholesterol in the body, and it's going to deliver that cholesterol to our body cells. Cholesterol generally gets a bad rap. We see it on the back of the nutrition labels of the foods that we eat, and we generally think that cholesterol is bad for us. But we must remember that cholesterol is actually responsible for stabilizing our cell membrane, and it's very important that we get a certain amount of cholesterol in our body as well. It is when our diet starts to increase in cholesterol that we start to have potential issues. Low-density lipoproteins take cholesterol to our body cells, which is why LDLs are often called bad cholesterol, because they take cholesterol out to our body cells. High-density lipoproteins, or HDLs, are often termed good cholesterol, because the HDLs will take excessive cholesterol from our body cells and take them back to the liver so that they can be eliminated from the body. It is very important that we keep appropriate numbers of lipoproteins so that adequate amounts of cholesterol and triglycerides can be delivered out to our body tissues, but also delivered back from our body tissues for elimination as well. Much of the cholesterol that we can find in our body is going to be from the diet, such as in eggs, dairy, and different types of meats. But in fact, the majority of the cholesterol in our bodies is actually made by hepatocytes. Diets that are very high in cholesterol are associated with greater risk of coronary artery disease. Generally, to combat coronary artery disease, increasing one's exercise and improving the diet are often preventative measures that are suggested for individuals that have high cholesterol. There are also classes of drugs that are solely used to decrease cholesterol levels. So that concludes what we need to know about lipid metabolism, and now we're going to transition into protein metabolism. Proteins, as we know, are broken down from very, very large polypeptide chains into amino acids. But unlike lipids and carbohydrates, amino acids are not stored in the body. Instead, amino acids will be either used to make new proteins or perhaps to produce ATP. I don't think that we need to go over the laundry list of all of the functions that proteins offer us. But I will just quickly mention that proteins do serve as enzymes, they serve as antibodies, and they can also be used as hormones in the body, such as insulin. Protein catabolism consists of breaking down large polypeptide chains into amino acids, which can then further be converted into other amino acids, perhaps fatty acids, or even glucose itself. If we can get glucose from proteins, therefore we can use proteins to create ATP. Protein anabolism is just another word for protein synthesis, which was a process discussed in A&P 1. DNA will code for a strip of mRNA that will be brought out of the nucleus into a ribosome. The ribosome will then facilitate the linking of amino acids from different molecules of transfer RNA, and it is through this process that we will form new proteins. So I'm going to take some time to review the concepts that are related to metabolism. So in summary, metabolism can be separated into glucose metabolism, lipid metabolism, and protein metabolism. Glucose metabolism can be further separated into glucose catabolism and glucose anabolism. Glucose catabolism is the conversion of glucose into 30 or 32 molecules of ATP. Glucose is our primary source of ATP in our cells, and glucose catabolism includes glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, as well as the electron transport chain. Glycolysis is the first step in glucose catabolism. This is the conversion of glucose into a molecule known as pyruvic acid, and this is the one reaction in cellular respiration that does not require oxygen. We also have the formation of acetyl coenzyme A, which is where pyruvate will be converted into acetyl coenzyme A to be channeled into the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle will require oxygen, and it will also produce a little bit of ATP as well. But the major takeaway from the Krebs cycle is NADH and FADH, which will carry our electrons over to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is the reaction in cellular respiration that produces the most ATP. And just like the rest, it's going to require oxygen. On the other end, if we have excess glucose and we want to store that glucose for later use, we're going to undergo the process of glycogenesis, where we take glucose monomers and link them together to form the molecule known as glycogen. Glycogen is our body's primary storage polysaccharide, and this can be later broken down into glucose in the event that we have plenty of glucose for the ATP that our body needs. In the event that we do have excess glucose, we're going to be able to build up triglycerides from that and then store that glucose as triglycerides. Triglycerides are the storage form of fat, and these will be housed in adipose tissue. When we take fatty acids and triglycerides in through our digestive system, we're going to break these substances down into glycerol and fatty acids. Glycerol can then be used to form glucose in the event that we don't have enough glucose. And fatty acids can eventually go and be catabolized down into acetyl coenzyme A, which can enter the Krebs cycle and produce more ATP. Our last macromolecule to summarize are proteins. Protein catabolism includes breaking down polypeptides into amino acids that will either be converted into glucose for energy or be reused to synthesize new proteins. Protein anabolism refers to protein synthesis that utilizes mRNA as well as ribosomes. So to make sure that we are all on the same page, we're going to define the terms fasting and starvation. Oftentimes, we jokingly use these terms interchangeably, but in fact, fasting and starvation are totally two different things. Fasting is when we've gone without food for several hours or a few days, while starvation is going without food for weeks to months. I personally feel like I'm going into starvation after going without food for a couple hours, but that is in fact a fasting state, and it's much, much healthier than starvation. In times of starvation specifically, our body starts to amp up production of what are known as ketone bodies. The presence of ketone bodies starts to increase as the breakdown of fatty acids increases in our bodies. More fatty acid catabolism takes place when we're undergoing starvation and we're not bringing in adequate amounts of glucose, so we're going to be tapping into our body's fatty acids. Ketone bodies are a substituent of the fatty acids, and they can also be used in the event that we don't have any glucose present. So the total amount of energy that our body takes in is completely dependent on the amount of food that we are consuming. Diets that are high in calories are going to provide more energy. Our total energy expenditure refers to all of the different things that our body spends energy on. 60% of our total energy expenditure goes to our basal metabolic rate. 30 to 35% goes to the physical activity that we're going to exert, and the other 5 to 10% goes into food-induced thermogenesis. Our body's basal metabolic rate is the rate at which metabolism is progressing when our body is in a quiet, resting state. Normally, as long as we're not taking in massive amounts of food or exerting ourselves in physical activity, most of the time we're going to be experiencing the basal metabolic rate. This accounts for about 60% of our total energy expenditure. Another 30 to 35% is in our physical activity. Physical activity includes deliberate physical activities, such as going out and exercising or walking to and from your car. This, of course, can change, and if we're not burning off as much energy as we're taking in, we're going to eventually store that energy in adipose tissue. Food-induced thermogenesis is the energy that it takes to break down food through digestion. You might remember that as we get older, the basal metabolic rate does tend to go down. Therefore, it can be much more challenging for older individuals to burn off excess fat, because they'll have to account for this with more physical activity. You can see the basal metabolic rate is defined over here. This is the metabolic rate that your body is undergoing in a quiet, resting, and fasting state. The faster the basal metabolic rate, the faster our body is going to burn off excess energy. One of the other areas that metabolism is very important for us is in body temperature regulation. Metabolism is one of the ways that our body is going to increase its heat in the event that our body's temperature has gone too low. In order for us to maintain homeostasis of our body's temperature, we must equal the heat lost to the heat gained. In the event that these are not the same, we're either going to increase our body temperature or decrease our body temperature, depending on how much heat is lost and how much heat is gained. If we lose more heat than is gained, we're going to decrease our body temperature. But if we gain more heat than is lost, we're going to increase our body temperature. And you can see an example of this feedback loop shown right here. So the controlled condition is body temperature. And when the body temperature is decreased, different thermoreceptors are going to be sending out signals to different places in our bodies to increase body temperature. One of the things that we're going to see is that we're going to have more skeletal muscle contraction. We're going to start shivering. And this is why we shiver, so that we can increase temperature when our body is cold. Muscle contraction does produce heat, so this is one way that we can return our body's temperature back to normal in the event that it gets too cold. One of the other things that our body's going to do is that it's going to increase our metabolic rate by producing more thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is going to regulate our body's metabolic rate because metabolism does in fact produce heat. We'll see a couple other effects here as well, one of which is vasoconstriction, which is going to prevent heat loss through the skin. By constricting blood flow, the heat in our blood is able to be retained by our body, as it's not going to pass through the skin and radiate that heat off. You can see that there are a lot of factors that affect our basal metabolic rate. Our exercise levels is one in particular that's going to increase our basal metabolic rate. The more we exercise, the faster our metabolism is going to be. Hormones are also going to increase basal metabolic rate, such as thyroid hormone from the thyroid gland. The autonomic nervous system will play a big role here as well, but body temperature itself can also increase our basal metabolic rate. Higher temperatures tend to speed up metabolism, and ingestion of food will also pick up metabolism so that we can break down the substances that we just brought into the body. As well as our age, there are many other factors that will actually affect our basal metabolic rate, such as how much we're sleeping, what our nutrition is, and even the climate that we live in. By increasing metabolic rate, more heat's going to be produced by our body, and therefore that will restore our body temperature back to normal. And we're going to move into food intake here on this slide, and we're going to see that there are two hormones that actually regulate our body's food intake. Leptin and ghrelin are going to work together to regulate how hungry we are. Leptin is a hormone that's released by adipose tissue, and this is the hormone that makes you feel full. Ghrelin, on the other hand, is released by the stomach, and this hormone is going to make you feel hungry. So when your levels of leptin go up, you're going to be less hungry. When your levels of ghrelin go up, you're going to be more hungry. And it is with these two hormones that we get a basis for a couple eating disorders. We're going to first start with obesity. Obesity can be defined as a body weight that is greater than 20% of the desirable standard, and we have an excessive accumulation of adipose tissue with this condition. On the other end of things, we also have anorexia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa is a disorder that is characterized by deliberately not taking in adequate amounts of food. Individuals with anorexia will often look in the mirror and see themselves much larger than they actually are. So despite the fact that this is a cartoon, I think this picture really demonstrates anorexia nervosa very, very well. In the same group as anorexia nervosa, we also have bulimia, which is characterized by eating large amounts of food and then triggering regurgitation so that the body does not absorb any of those nutrients. With a lack of nutrients we get from bulimia and anorexia nervosa, individuals are often seen wasting away. Now, I've just used the term nutrients, and we use that term all the time here in anatomy and physiology, but you might be wondering what the actual definition of a nutrient is. A nutrient is any substance that our body's going to use for cell growth or repair. Our macromolecules, as well as water, minerals, and vitamins, are all examples of nutrients. This is more of a blanket term to describe any types of substances that our bodies need to facilitate growth and be considered healthy. The U.S. Department of Agriculture makes some recommendations upon how many nutrients we're supposed to be bringing into our bodies daily. It is recommended that the majority of our body's macronutrient intake is carbohydrates. Between 50 and 60% of the food that we eat should be large complex polysaccharides. We don't want to have too many simple sugars because those can raise blood sugar. The next thing that we should be looking for in our diet are fats. 30% of what we take in should be fats. But we're not looking for saturated fats, we want more healthy fats such as unsaturated fats. Saturated fats stack more tightly on each other, and so they can be much more challenging to break down. Unsaturated fats are much easier to burn off, and they're generally considered much healthier. Proteins, on the other hand, should make up the remaining 12 to 15% of the diet. Meats, beans, and lentils are all examples of foods that are high in proteins. Another couple terms that we want to put definitions to are vitamins and minerals. Minerals are inorganic elements, which means that they're generally smaller and do not contain any carbon within their molecular structure. You can see a couple examples of minerals shown down here. Potassium is one mineral that's very important for the body. We have to have potassium to facilitate action potential propagation. This is just one example of what potassium does for the body. But potassium is a mineral, just like iron, just like calcium, just like magnesium. Calcium, of course, is going to be the most abundant mineral that we have in the entire body. Calcium is primarily going to be found in our bones, and it is in fact what makes our bones very hard and structurally sound. Iron, of course, is going to be used by our red blood cells. This is part of the protein hemoglobin, and this will be used to bind to oxygen. Even though it's not listed, I will just mention that sodium is another very important mineral that our bodies require. We also have vitamins, which are nutrients that our bodies generally are not able to produce on their own. And one example of a vitamin that we're going to see is vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 can only be found from our diet. We cannot produce vitamin B12, but it is very necessary in our overall health that our body's going to need to function. Malnutrition is a lack of any vital nutrients that our bodies normally need to function properly. Two types of malnutrition are referring to kwashiorkor syndrome and marasmus. You can see that this baby over here is representing kwashiorkor syndrome. Kwashiorkor syndrome refers to an overall lack of protein intake by the body. Individuals with kwashiorkor are generally able to take in plenty of carbohydrates, but they don't get adequate protein, and that's generally going to mean that they're lacking their essential amino acids. Some characteristics of kwashiorkor is this very large belly and very plump limbs. Marasmus, on the other hand, refers to an overall deficit of food intake. You can see the bones of this child through his skin, and essentially this child is wasting away, as there's no protein, carbohydrate, or lipid intake that this child is able to find. So this is actually going to sum up what you need for Chapter 25. The remaining PowerPoint slides of this presentation contain very interesting information regarding vitamins and minerals. The information on these upcoming slides is very important, but to the degree that I plan to test you, you've pretty much gotten what you need from Chapter 25 thus far. I am going to just real quickly touch on some of the information that you should already know about some of these vitamins and minerals, but again, most of this will be for your self-study. So calcium is in fact the most abundant mineral that we have in the body. Most of our calcium is actually stored in our bones and teeth, and our blood calcium levels are going to be controlled by parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. We discussed that feedback loop during the endocrine system. Through anatomy and physiology, you should have extensively talked about potassium as well. This is the primary cation in the intracellular fluid. There's a very high concentration of potassium inside of our cells, and this is going to be very important for action potential propagation, along with sodium, which is our most abundant cation in the extracellular fluid. We will see in our next couple chapters that sodium is going to play an extremely important role for the reabsorption of fluids in the kidneys. And this is along with chloride. Iron, I have mentioned, is found in great concentrations in the hemoglobin in our blood cells. This is going to be extremely important for the binding of hemoglobin to oxygen to facilitate oxygen transport throughout the body. I'm going to move forward here to a special vitamin known as vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is the only vitamin that we cannot get from vegetables. And we can only absorb vitamin B12 as long as we have intrinsic factor that's being released by the parietal cells in the stomach. Liver, kidneys, milk, eggs, cheese, and meat are general sources of vitamin B12. So what you may have noticed about each of these sources for vitamin B12 is that none of them are particularly allowed on a strictly vegan diet. This is not to say that the vegan diet is not manageable. However, individuals on this sort of diet will generally have to take a vitamin B12 supplement to make sure that they're getting everything that they need on this diet. I will not burden you guys with going over any more of these vitamins and minerals, and that will conclude our presentation on Chapter 25. If you have any questions, please be sure to reach out, and I will see you all in our next lecture presentation when we will start covering the urinary system.